Good morning, good morning, good morning, LinkedIn Live. We are live on Friday. I hope you've had a good week. Welcome if you're joining us on the replay as well. Thank you for checking this out. I am live with Charlie Atkins. Good morning, Charlie.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining me, Charlie. I know we connected a little while ago. Those of you that don't know Charlie, please do check out his bio. You'll find a link to Charlie Atkins. So I'm gonna try to do some sort of an intro, Charlie. But you do so many things that you might need to chip in yourself. So Charlie is your final year student now, aren't you? You're going back into your final year after some
Yeah, I'm
holiday.
entering my final year in a few weeks.
Final year at Warwick Uni. But when you're not doing that, we'll get a little bit into in terms of what you're studying and how you got into the topic of social capital. When you're not doing that, you're kind of running something on the side, which is about inspiring young people. It's called Inspiring Young Futures. I think that's right, isn't it?
Yeah, inspire your future.
Inspire your future. Inspire your future. Perfect. Good morning, Safia. Thank you so much for joining us. This is going to be a good conversation for sure. So, so what we're going to get into, we're going to get into the topic of social capital. And I am going to ask Charlie to define what social capital is, because that's kind of how we connected. I was doing my sort of like searching around this thing called social capital. What is it? Um, so, in fact, before we get into the conversation, just give us a quick definition of social capital in terms of what it is. So, what do we mean by this thing called social capital?
Sure, I think social capital is one thing that's quite hard to pin down a definition. I've done a lot of sort of searching around on the internet and looking at sort of what different academics are calling it and what other sort of students are calling it.
Yeah,
And I think it really comes down to the network that you have, but it's a little bit more than that in terms of your understanding and sort of utilization of this network.
yeah,
So I think for me, social capital is the sort of size, the sort of quality of the network that you have, but then your ability to really take advantage and make the use of that network.
yeah. Okay, perfect, perfect. So, if that's what you're interested in, social capital linking to social mobility, which is something we'll talk about, then you're in the right place. Good morning, Sophia, and good morning, Survey, as well. Thank you so much for joining us. So, social capital. So just to explain how I came across it, I do some work with the Black Talent Awards, as some people might know. We've got our awards next week, and last year which was the first year, we wanted to bring on board some youth judges that don't often necessarily have the opportunity to network with some of the people that we had as our more experienced judges, right? And one of the things that I noticed, and I remember we had this conversation about it, was the fact that for some of our youth judges, it's almost like, were they able to take advantage fully of the opportunity that was presented? So that might have been, did they have the networking skills? Did they even know what questions to ask, etc.? Do you know what I mean? I was like,
Mm.
what is this? What is it that, what's that invisible thing that kind of almost like makes the difference around, whether or not they are or aren't able to take advantage of those opportunities. And then I sort of started Googling and came across social capital. And that's kind of part of why we're having this conversation today. Another few good mornings. Good morning, Rasha. Hope you're well. Good morning, Samantha. Morning, Samantha. Yes, I think you put moo originally, but morning. I think we got what you had. So just to share a few statistics, in the State of the Nation 2023 report that has recently been released by the Social Mobility Commission. In fact, it was last month, I think,
Yeah, it
Charlie.
was really recently.
Yes, the Social Mobility, or actually this month maybe, the Social Mobility Commission have released a report called the State of the Nation 2023. And in the chapter on people and places, they've talked about the drivers and the background conditions that help or hinder social mobility. So, in terms of our ability to, if, for example, we're born into a certain um, socioeconomic background, our ability to transcend that and to almost like, rise out of it. So, what they've said is that social capital is one of the drivers that actually helps or hinders when it comes to social mobility. And they've said, we have found that adults with lower working class parents, so if your parents are in the lower working class bracket, are about 3 times as likely to be in a working class occupation. And I think a couple of years ago, I think Goldman Sachs did a report that said generally the UK is not great when it comes to social mobility for whatever reasons. That might be legacy class system. I don't know, have you got a view about that, Charlie, in terms of why the UK, if we were to compare it to other countries, say for example the US, which is kind of almost like the land of, you know, skyscrapers, and you know, why you think the UK might be different to that? Got any thoughts on that?
I, th- I think there's lots of different factors that come together for social mobility. And I think social mobility is so important, and that's why I really got into social capital as it said in the report, as one of the drivers for social mobility.
Yeah,
I think there's lots of different factors that have an impact on social mobility, and I think it comes down a little bit to the opportunities that young people have. Maybe that might be for education or for sort of other work
hmm,
placements, and sort of how you. I think aspiration also comes into it. So what it is that you want to achieve. Um, and then whether you think that this is possible. I think that's where social capital is really important for showing you that yes, you can have that job, or there's these things out there that you might not even know about.
yeah,
Um, I think I saw a really interesting video recently where someone was talking. I think they were from Wales, and when they were talking about the city, they just assumed it was Cardiff, and hadn't really thought about London at all. So for them, it was, oh, if people went to work in the city, that was going towards Cardiff or Swansea. Um, and London wasn't even really a consideration for them. I can't remember where I saw it now, but I think it's really knowing, sort of having that view of maybe what London is, or maybe what some of these big companies are. I know there were so many names that I found out when I came to university that I really didn't think about before. Some of these really big finance firms, for example. I think it's really sort of increasing knowledge and aspiration as well, of knowing that these companies are out there and you can work for them, or you can do this
yeah.
if you want to.
Yeah, that's a fascinating example there. And actually, if we delve into that aspect, first of all, around social capital, which is just that thing about even knowing what is out there. So, for example, as you've just said there, the city, you know, that term, the city, there's a great book actually about, you know, the city in terms of meritocracy and class and all of that sort of thing.
Mm.
If I can remember the name, I'll kind of put it in the comments afterwards. But the city, in terms of, you know, as you say, the big, you know, the big financial firms, and then you know, we sometimes expand it to be, you know, then the law firms
Yeah.
and the accountancy firms that then support that mechanism of the city. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I trained at EY. So some people know I trained at EY many years ago, like millions of years ago. But actually, before I even came to apply for those firms, I'd never even heard of those firms. You know, EY, KPMG, PwC. If you're not in that world, you don't even know. So I guess thinking about, you know, the advantages and the disadvantages. So should we just talk about that a little bit more in terms of, you know, what does it look like when social capital is an advantage versus when social capital, or the lack of social capital, is a disadvantage? How do you sort of sometimes see that play out?
So I think there are definitely lots of advantages to social capital, and it's one thing which is why I'm really passionate about talking about it. Because when I look back at the few things that I think I've been successful at, particularly when it's application sort of based, social capital I think has played a massively important factor. Whenever I've been applying sort of research grants or internships, I found that having spoken to somebody or a few people who worked at the company, or a few different people who have been involved, that I think that's been one of the things that have definitely tipped the scales in my favor. And I think that there's lots of reasons for that. But firstly, you have a better understanding of whether it's the organization or the role that you're going into, or maybe sort of the direction places are going, just by speaking to somebody who's on the inside,
Yeah,
give you a very different take to what you might find on the internet.
yeah,
And then I think particularly when you're younger, the fact that you've reached out to somebody, or the fact that you're sort of really using your social capital is very impressive.
yeah,
I think that really helps. So I think one piece of advice is really to take advantage of the position you're in, whether
yeah,
you're under 18 or whether you're currently studying at university, whether you're on an internship. I think saying that you're a student, I found to be incredibly helpful. I think a lot of people are a lot more receptive
yeah,
when they see that you're really trying to understand something better, or you're really passionate about a certain area.
mm,
So I think it really gives you that deeper understanding, which otherwise you don't have. And I think if you go into potentially an interview and you've read the website, which is great, and you've really researched a firm, for example, I
mm,
think when you can take maybe say a name, or say a few different things that aren't on the website, or a few observations about maybe ways that the industry is changing, that can really help set you apart. And I think those things come out of some of the conversations that you can have with people. And it definitely means that if you were successful, so I know with my internship, when I then started, I was able to reconnect with all the people I'd spoken to before. And that really started to build a network within the company of a load of different people I could speak
mm,
to. And it was a lot of conversations about, oh, I'd spoken to them before I started, or they recommended that I would speak to you as well. So I think it really gives you a leg up in terms of your knowledge and then being able to grow your network further.
How did you figure out how to do this? And this is the bit that I'm quite interested in. And I guess and part of the reason that you're quite passionate about it is because you're not traditionally from the background where you have had that leg up. So how did you figure out the importance of things like that? You know, the importance of reaching out to somebody such that when you're then applying, you can say, "Oh, I've spoken to such and such," or "I've had advice from that." Do you know what I mean? So, what was your
Yeah.
journey learning about social capital?
I think it's been a little bit trial and error.
Yeah.
No one ever sort of says this to you. I think I've been able to find out a lot for myself. But I think going back to when I was at school, I was quite fortunate that I wanted to organise a TEDx youth event. And it was sort of the first event like that at my school. And I
Mm,
had this vision of sort of highlighting the opportunities within education,
yeah.
particularly when you're going to A levels, you're choosing to be there. And I thought it
Mm,
was such a great opportunity. And I really wanted to highlight that to students and sort of bring a different way to communicate between staff and students so they could talk a little bit more about what they were interested and
yeah.
students be able to see different sides of the teachers. And it was sort of from that really that I sort of started to speak to different people in a way that I haven't done before.
Yeah.
I think when you approach somebody to speak about something that they're really passionate about, you have a very different conversation when you're asking people, what is it that you're really interested in? Why are you interested in this?
Yeah.
And what do you see changing within that field? I
Yeah.
think it was from that where I started Inspire Your Future, and I had this idea of bringing people that you might not be able to speak to before. So I wanted to, I don't know, when I was looking at what university course I want to study, it was really hard to find courses that I was interested in, and then
Mm,
find a lot of information about them to be like, oh, is this something I want to study for 3 years?
yeah.
And I had this idea of bringing a few different academics who could speak about their subject, target students, and then students wouldn't have to try and find them. I'd have them all there. They'd be on a platform where you can just quite easily digest this content.
Yeah.
And I think it was through that process that I really found the value of speaking to people. And then I was in a position where I'd speak to one person and they'd be like, oh, this other, like they'd be also be really interested in what you're talking about. And I'd
Yeah.
really be able to sort of start to build a network from there. And I think I knew I wanted to limit down what I was doing. I wanted to have a really niche focus. And I thought the one thing that I didn't read much about before was social capital and networking. I think this is one area that can make such a big difference. And I
Yeah.
found it so helpful in my life that I sort of came across this decision. I think I learn so much every day. In every conversation I have with people, I walk away thinking, oh, actually, when you're having these conversations, the importance of context, for example, so making sure that you really back up your questions with what's happening within the field, or if it's sort of more economics based, talk about like how this is impacting from high inflation, for example. So you definitely learn a lot as you go along. But I think from some of the conversations I've had, I really understood how important it was. And then when people were connecting me with other people, I was like, a lot of the work is now being done for me. Like I'm not having to reach out; people are sort of reaching out to
Mhm.
me.
Yeah.
And it's when you sort of hit that tipping point that I think I really understood how vital it was.
Right. The tipping point of because I guess when you first started that, the say for example the TEDx thing, you were having to almost like cold
Yeah,
call, like just reach out to people. But actually, that's really interesting that you refer to it as a tipping point in terms of probably similar to like how we connected
yeah,
and where we are. And then as a result of that, I've then sort of said reached out to my network and said, actually, you know, you need to meet Charlie. He's doing X, Y, and Z, and this is how it. And it just has that effect, especially if people see you as somebody that, you know, as you say, is passionate about what you're doing, know what you're talking about, and is there to offer value. And in a space like this where it helps other people, I think people are then more than willing to open their black book, right?
yeah. And I think when it's social capital, I think the one thing that has been really helpful for me is
Yeah,
it's something that affects everybody and everyone's got their own link to it. So I found I've been able to have some really different conversations about social capital
yeah,
and how people have reflected on their own networks or how they've been able to support different people. But it is that sort of point where firstly like it's a point of your confidence and then also of that
mm,
sort of where your networks are at such a size now that people are wanting to connect with you and not just you wanting to connect with
yeah,
them.
yeah,
I think that comes with time and it's sort of something that you develop and
yeah.
it comes eventually.
It's really interesting. As you were talking there, one of the things I was reminded of, I was once listening to a radio show where they were talking about private education versus state school, and it actually led to me doing a LinkedIn live with Eric Sterling. This is back last year, and
Yeah.
we were talking about the advantage that that can bring in the workplace. And it sort of links to this, but one of the things that the speakers on this Radio 4 program said was, when children that go to private school, just as an example, they tend to have it instilled in them that they will be the future leaders and people that they see, in government, at the top of firms, etc. Right? They see that it's instilled in them that that will be your future. And you don't kind of get the same, individuals in like state schools don't get that same thing. In fact, they possibly almost see it as a barrier, and they sort of think, I won't be in that space, I can't speak to them. So actually, one of the speakers on that radio show was basically saying, if you've got kids that are in state school, encourage your kids to write into their MP or somebody that they see on TV, get them to realize that those other people are just normal, and actually they can interact with them, they can share the same spaces. It's not a case of those spaces aren't for people like us. Do you know what I mean? And I say that as somebody from completely working class background, single parent mom, all of those sorts of things. There's something about, and you mentioned aspiration. There is something about that
Yeah.
mindset that means that you are comfortable to go into those other social spaces, right?
Yeah, I think it's something that we've spoken about before, and it's seeing all of these opportunities as being possibilities.
Yeah,
I know before, so it was mentioned about the city, and it's knowing what that is, and that you could work at one of these firms if you wanted to, or what it is. Maybe your ambition is to go to university, and it might be that you're at a school where not many people go to university, but that's still an option. And I think sometimes this is where social capital is important, because
yeah,
the more people you speak to, the more people that you might find with a similar background to you. And
yeah,
it links down to that importance of representation, and
yeah,
how having visible figures in some of these high profile jobs
yeah.
being vital in showing that you can do that. There is somebody you might not, being the first person is great, but you might not be the first person. You might not have to face all these challenges for the first time. I think
Yeah,
speaking to people about their personal experiences is really helpful.
yeah,
I know, particularly whether that's for university or for an internship or for a graduate job, when you
yeah,
can sort of speak to people or see people who are like you and
yeah,
having done that. I think this is where I talk about LinkedIn being really important. And there's lots of ways that you can use LinkedIn that you might not think about. And one of
mm,
my favorite things to do on LinkedIn is looking at people's sort of work history and their education. I think finding your school might be quite difficult if you don't go to a very big school, but then university I found really helpful. So I'm looking at people. So I study at Warwick. So I look at people who've been at Warwick and then what they've done, as this would be a possibility. And it's like, oh, I search for some of the jobs on LinkedIn
yeah,
that I might really want to have one day. And I look at who's doing that now. Where did they work before? What roles did they have before? And I
mm,
sort of have mapped out a few different versions of, oh, if I want this job, these are some of the things that people have done to get there. And I think, oh, is there any of those routes that appeal to me?
yeah,
And during my internship, I was looking at some of the senior figures and thinking, how did you get there? What roles did you do? How long are you in particular roles? I think
yeah,
that's one thing where LinkedIn can show you that these are possibilities. And I think it's great when you see someone who has done an undergrad and then has done a master's and then worked around in a few different places. So they've
yeah,
got to where I want to go, but in a route that I'd never have imagined. And it's saying
yeah,
that if you don't get this job straight out of uni, that's
yeah,
okay, because these three people spent 5 years doing completely different things before they ended up there. And I think
yeah,
that's one thing where it can really show you that there are
yeah,
possibilities out there. You can see people who have done an apprenticeship, or you can
yeah,
see people who have worked in 10 different companies moving around before they've really
yeah,
sort of settled in one area. And
mm,
it can show you that sort of these are possibilities. And I think this is really helping with that sort of aspiration.
yeah. I love it. It almost sounds like, almost, I'm going to use the term. It's almost like you've hacked social capital, right? Because and just to pick up on like some of the things that Sophia's saying, this is something all young people can be encouraged to develop towards social capital. I think that's kind of what you're proving, Charlie. Actually, I think when I say that you've hacked it in terms of like network development, so Sophia's picked up here network development, and we'll talk about, I guess, the mentoring piece and the training and maybe what companies can do. It's not what sometimes it's who sometimes it's what about who cultural barriers can hinder progression. Definitely that links to the representation piece. But when I say you've hacked social capital, Charlie, what I mean by that is, so some people are fortunate enough that because of the families that they're born into, or maybe there's somebody in the family that works in the city, right? They get to hear about these roles, so they know what the city is because they've got an uncle that works in the city, or their dad works in the city, or their mom works in the city. So they hear about the city, They know the sorts of roles. They know that you need a 2-1 degree to get into the big four, you know, the big four being the big four accounting firms.
Yeah.
So some people are almost like, some people almost inherit, right, that social capital, don't they? Almost through birth, through a product of being born into a certain family or a certain class, if we put it like that. But actually, what you've shown, Charlie, is that by a little bit of research and just, and you know, because you've learned some of it and being savvy,
Mm.
anybody can actually almost like hack into social capital and pick up on some of those tools and start to apply them to create their own positive social capital, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and linked to I think it was in the comments. But one thing I found is I was quite fortunate that Warwick offer funding if you want to do research as an undergraduate.
Mm,
So I was quite fortunate to be able to get some funding, and I sort of conducted a pilot project looking at schools.
yeah,
But as part of that, I did a lot of sort of quite a big literature review, and there's not much about social capital out there, but I've read quite a lot of really interesting pieces and spoken to some really fascinating people. I think one thing that I've really learned is that everybody everybody's in a very similar position and everyone needs the same sort of help,
yeah,
whether you've got a really big network or you haven't. No one's born knowing really how to take advantage of a network. However, I
mhm,
think some of the access to this information is what's different. So
yeah,
everyone might need the same sort of support, but for one young person it might be sort of handed to them a little bit easier, or they might know where to find it, or they might be spoken to about it a little bit more. And there
yeah,
might be another young person who doesn't know where to look, doesn't really think about how they can grow a network, hasn't
yeah,
really considered what different opportunities there might be. And
yeah,
it's how you can provide support to make sure everyone can go out and sort of find a lot of these things for
yeah,
themselves. I think one thing I'm sort of really interested in, the fact that social capital is a concept that I think most people are aware of. If you think about if you've got a leak in your house, one of the things you might do, or something I see quite a lot on like the
mm,
Facebook group for where I live, is asking for recommendations. And that's social capital
yeah,
ultimately, is sort of asking, reaching out to a few people that you know, asking for a recommendation or a bit of help. So I
yeah,
think everyone knows what social capital is. Everyone's probably used it at some point, whether they need a plumber or whether they've got another question or whether they're looking for something to do on the weekend. But
yeah,
it's whether you sort of apply that to your professional development as well, and whether
yeah,
you think, oh, you can use that same thing and say, oh, do you know someone who's gone to university, or do you know someone who works at one of these companies?
yeah,
So social capital isn't a new concept for a lot of people, but it's how you
no,
sort of think about it and how you think about utilizing it, which
yeah.
is why I think social capital is more than just the network of people that you know, but more about how you can utilize and really take advantage of them as well.
Yeah. And breaking into and breaking into new networks, I think
Yeah.
that's the key. Because if we think about the advantage versus the disadvantage that some people might have, for some people, as you're saying, either they might be closer to individuals that will talk about those networks and or make the introductions. You know, we all know that there are, you know, there are some parents that will, um, you know, kind of take the steps to, for example, get their offspring work experience, say, or an
Mm.
internship or something like that, right? So some people have that almost like a head start in terms of accessing the network, and then some people have to work a bit harder because maybe that network isn't in their, you know, their row of like first or second connections. They have to go a bit further. I think there is something, and we can talk about this. And you know, Sophia says here, yes, Charlie, it's so true. Just knowing where to go to secure the information. This is where support, mentoring, and training is powerful. And the one thing I say as well for those that are listening, who obviously you know those of us that are slightly older and are in the network and maybe more connected, I would definitely say, you know, when young people reach out to you for, you know, advice or questions, and you can add into this, Charlie, in terms of, I think one of the things that we can do, and something I learned is sometimes there's opening a door, but sometimes you have to, and this is what I learned from last year at the Black Talent Awards with our youth judges. You can open a door. Sometimes you have to help people get through that door. And what I mean by
Yeah.
that is if you give somebody an introduction, so as an example, I gave somebody an introduction this year to one of our judges, our senior judges, and I said to her, I said, right, I literally almost like coached her through how to follow up on that introduction. So I said, you know, write I said, I'm going to introduce you via email. You then write a follow up email, but let me see it first before you send it to that person. And I almost like helped her craft then the follow up and advise, you know, this is what this person could help you with. This is how to take it. Because sometimes I think either sometimes we don't open doors and we don't open our network and make it available, or sometimes we don't help people going through the doors, and not everybody is able to figure out even what to say or do with those connections. Is that something you've come across, Charlie?
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, and it's one thing I was thinking about is how you can provide support. So particularly interested in young people, but it sort of applies to everyone. But how you
Yeah,
can provide the
yeah,
support, because I think mentoring is one thing that's come up, and I think mentoring is incredibly valuable. And there's lots of companies out there or like charities. So Grow, I think, is one within sort of the legal space, which
mm,
so I've looked a lot about that recently. But mentoring is so powerful in terms of building these connections.
yeah,
But I think there's lots more that you can do in terms of training for young people in terms of how you might build these connections, how to reach out, how to start the contact, how to sort of maintain a relationship.
yeah,
But then, as you sort of picked up on, it's how you can support the other side as well. So if you're connecting somebody, yes, you might be used to just sending an email, and that's great. But for someone who hasn't had many conversations with different people, it's maybe you can add a few sort of points of maybe you could reach out with something like this if you want to sort of talk about. I just said
yeah,
read the email before. If you've got any other questions, reach out to me. And how I think coaching people through that can be really vital, and it's supporting both sides to make sure that people are able to take advantage as much
yeah,
as possible.
yeah,
Because it's great having a connection and it's great having one conversation with somebody, but it's how you can sort of build that relationship. And confidence is a massive thing. I know when I started reaching out to people, a lot of the time you might not get a reply. Um, People are very busy. They might not check a LinkedIn message, or they might not see an email,
yeah,
and they might not think it's particularly something they're massively interested in. So people are very busy and they might not all get back to you. I
yeah,
think it's taken a while for me to be able to get over that, and I think definitely send quality tailored messages to people. But I think over time you realize not everyone's going to respond. That's
yeah,
okay. It's nothing against you personally. You don't know how busy they are. I think building that confidence as you go through and really coaching both sides. I think one thing that I try and do when people reach out, I try to respond to as many people as possible. I think a lot of the messages I get now, and I really love sort of when people reach out, is so the degree I study is economics, psychology, and philosophy, and it's very niche. And at the moment, I'm only sort of aware of Warwick that offer it. So a lot of people reach out asking a little bit more about the degree because there's not that much online, because it's very niche. There's not many of us. The first cohort graduated this year. So I think
okay,
it's when you're looking for more information, people reach out, and I try and respond best I can or connect people.
yeah,
But I think it's how you can support both sides. So if a young person's reached out to you, these are some things that you might be able to say to them, and thinking about they might not be that confident. You might be the first person that they've spoken to.
yeah,
So it's how you can sort of maybe coach that conversation. I think when I reach out to people now, I try and take more of a lead in that conversation. So I really prepare some questions beforehand. But if you're sort of in your first few calls with people, you might not be as confident. You might not know about what to say. So it's how the other side can really support
yeah.
the young person to make sure they can get as much value as possible as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And Omar's put a few good comments in here. So first of all, see if I can go back to that one. We usually talk about mentoring and often miss talking about how sponsorship is equally or even more powerful. Absolutely, I talk about this in terms of sponsorship is often the thing that actually propels somebody, forwards and often upwards as well.
Yeah.
Actually, mentoring is about providing guidance, advice, and coaching to help individuals grow and develop, while sponsorship is about actively advocating for and promoting someone's career advancement by using your influence and connections. While mentoring offers guidance, sponsorship creates opportunities. Absolutely, couldn't agree with you more. And so there is something, like you were saying, Charlie, in terms of I think when people do reach out to us in our networks, really, can we offer them some sort of sponsorship? Or can we mentor and coach them onto onto our wider network, almost like lending somebody our network. There's the power of borrowed networks is really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's knowing sort of what your best position would be. And I think sometimes a lot of people have said to me, "Oh, take a look at my LinkedIn network. If there's someone that you're interested in who's a first or
Yeah,
second connection, just let me know. I can put you in touch." And
yeah,
I think it's knowing one thing. So I'm learning more all the time. One thing that came out of my internship was the differences between a coach, a mentor, and a sponsor, and
yeah,
how you don't just want one of them, you need all of them, and people
yeah,
play different roles. And it's really, and I think, again, understanding what those are. So when you're reaching out to people, you know whether they might be more better placed to be a sponsorship role. They're a little bit further ahead of you. They might not be able to mentor you and face similar challenges, and then knowing where someone might be a lot closer and they might
yeah,
be better being a coach or a mentor.
yeah,
So it's really having this understanding of these terms for one, and then how you can make them work for you.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, What do you think? Do you think there's more that companies could be doing around this topic of social capital to support, for example, to support their new grads or apprentices when they join? What do you think companies should be doing around this topic?
I think there's lots of different stages, and one thing when I'm speaking to people from companies, I'm really interested in how they support young people. I think there's some great companies offer some schemes, particularly targeted at school students,
Hmm.
as sort of insights into a particular firm, into a particular industry, and that's a first great step in building connections. And I think it's how you advertise these to make sure that as
Yeah.
many students as possible see them, and maybe it's that there needs to be some sort of other site which can be a great place for what the students should go, where they can see a lot of these opportunities. I
Yeah.
think as people join the workplace, representation is really important, and it's how you can potentially facilitate a few connections. Maybe it's offering some sort of networking event with a few pointers beforehand, a little info session, then bringing
Mm.
new graduates or sort of new joiners into contact with a few people who are already at the company. There's a great way
Yeah.
to build some of those connections. One thing I had at my internship was a buddy scheme, so I had two buddies. One of them was a young professional, one of them was someone within my team, and
Mhm.
that's sort of a great place to start. And they were then able to connect with a few more people as well. I think
Yeah.
it's having a few of these processes in place and then showing people, having sort of speak talks from people who are quite senior within companies as well, showing you, oh, that from sort of this background, or you can do this. This is my
Yeah.
route. My route might not be what you expect it to be.
Yeah.
So I think just having that exposure and representation is
Yeah.
really important.
Yeah, I love that. And what you said particularly there in terms of so if you're arranging, networking or mixers or whatever with, your grads and other individuals in the organization, giving them tips in terms of how to network, how to approach a senior leader, maybe even, how to craft your elevator pitch.
Yeah.
So that when you bump into a senior leader at the coffee machine or in the corridor, you know what to say, particularly if they've got an interesting project that you want to jump on or whatever it be. Yeah, it's really key. That's the thing about helping people walk through doors that are open. I think is really important. And then my final question, I guess, for us as sort of like parents, in particular, and wider society, with young people, what is it that we can do specifically? Maybe say for parents, what is it that parents can do in terms of helping young people, use social capital professionally to their advantage?
I think there's lots of different things, and one thing that so someone recommended for books to me, I've had it here. I think it's called A Curious Mind, and I've just started reading it, and it's really fascinating. And one thing that I sort of read in it was when you're reaching out, start with sort of don't start with people you don't know, start with sort of a closer network. And I think particularly for parents or people who know someone quite well, having sort of different conversations is really helpful. So maybe talking a little bit more about what you do or particular interest, and that's
Yeah.
probably not something you normally have. So you
Mhm.
can sort of recreate a little bit of the so I called it a bit of a coffee chat, but
Yeah.
recreating some of these positions where you probably haven't had this conversation about what you do for work or particular interests before.
Yeah.
And that can help to build confidence. I think also looking at who it is that might be a good person to reach out to, making sure that you help someone build a LinkedIn profile. For example, I think LinkedIn is massively important, whether you use it to reach out to people or just to have a little bit of a research.
Yeah.
So I think a little bit of that support and guidance, and maybe thinking about how you can guide someone towards particular areas.
Yeah.
But a little bit like a mock interview, having a few of these conversations and just helping sort of be curious how you can actively listen, how you can sort of really get involved in conversations,
Yeah.
and then really helping to sort of follow up and sort of keep. I think confidence and resilience is really important.
Yeah.
And I think you can be a little bit disheartened early on if people don't come back to you. And I think it's how you can work through that, because not everybody will, and it might take a while, and you have to send a few messages before people might start being really helpful. But it does happen. I think making sure you can stay confident, stay resilient is really important.
I love that. I absolutely love that. So helping, young people, well, helping your children, etc., and or nieces, nephews, connections, godchildren, or with things like mock interviews and asking them questions, being curious with them. I really like that. One of the other things that I used to do, which I recommended to somebody, so when my daughter was growing up, when she became sort of like a teenager, sort of mid-teens, and I used to go out to dinner with the girls, as you do, my small circle of friends that I met when I was working in my 20s, I started bringing her along because I sort of saw them as, first of all, they're not her mom, and I saw them as a good group of role models. And obviously, they did different jobs. One was another accountant, a contracts specialist, whatever. And I just thought it was useful for her, to sort of hear the conversation and know how to navigate that space and have a conversation with older people. So that's maybe one tip that I'd throw in, with your kids. Bring them along when you're having conversations with, with other adults
Yeah.
and older people.
I think that the general exposure. I think one thing I worked in a cafe, and I think at the time you might not see the relevance, but I think now when I look back, it's one of the best things I did. I really, really loved it there. I went back in the holidays of my first year of university, and it's just speaking to customers. It's not someone in your family, not someone you really know. I think
Yeah,
having that exposure to speaking to people you might not be too confident with, it is really vital, and it helps to build that confidence. Make sure you can have a few of
yeah,
these other conversations that you're not familiar with, and it all comes down to this sort of what your personal brand is, what you want people to think about when they see your name, or
yeah,
if they're thinking of a particular person, where you want to fit into that.
yeah.
Is what it's I think what it all boils down to.
Amazing, absolutely amazing. We're gonna leave it there because I've gone slightly over time as always. It's such a fascinating conversation, but I've absolutely loved it, Charlie. In terms of it's almost been like a masterclass. What you've almost done is it's almost like a masterclass in how to build your social capital. Because I definitely, at the start of this conversation, I definitely thought about social capital more as almost like something that you're not born with, but something that some people just do have it way easier. But actually, as you talk through how you have acquired more social capital, as I say, it's almost like you've kind of hacked the system. It's almost like, okay, if you're not, necessarily born with that network naturally around you, how do you create it for yourself? And hopefully people have taken something away from that they can pass on, to young people in their own network, and or when young people contact them. So where can people find you, and tell us a little bit more about your Inspire, your futures as well, and how people can find out more about that.
Yeah, you can feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I love talking about social capital. So anyone who wants to talk a little bit more, please feel free to reach out with questions or sort of a conversation. You can find a little bit more about me on my LinkedIn, or we have a website that's www.inspireyourfuture.com, I think. And there's a little bit more on there. I think one thing at the moment I'm really keen on working out what it is and how best to support young people. So anyone who's got any ideas or any ways that they've worked to really support young people, please reach out. I'm really keen to have some conversations and come to a way to really sort of build an area around supporting sort of young people, particularly on how to build and sort of develop and utilize your social capital.
Amazing. Brilliant. Charlie, thank you so much. I have learned so much in this LinkedIn Live, which is what I always really enjoy. The fact that I feel like I think the conversation is going to go one way at the start, and at the end my mind's blown because actually there's so much more information coming through. So thank you everybody for listening in. I hope it's been really useful. I hope you've all learned something, and I really hope that this has a big impact going forward on the young people that are either watching or young people in your lives. So that's it. Thanks again, Charlie.
No, thank you. This is the first sort of LinkedIn Live I've done. I've really enjoyed speaking to you, and I hope it's useful for everyone that's watched it. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you all for watching. Have a great weekend. Go with grace.
Thank you.